This is the Reimagine Richmond podcast, imagining our power to transform our visions. We know the system is broken, but we are not. We keep each other safe. In this series, community members will share their stories of safety and how they reimagine Richmond.
Welcome back to another episode. My name is Carmen. I'm the Superpoderosa Community Organizer with Reimagine Richmond.
We'll be looking at different programs which our community has worked hard to advocate, such as the Community Crisis Response Program. Today, we're lucky to have two guests who have been working on this program, have been advocating for it, and are here to share a little bit more about it. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves?
Hi everyone, my name is Yaquelin Valencia. I work for Faith in Action. I'm a campaign manager and I'm also a youth organizer, and I have been living in Richmond for over 25 years. Yeah. And I'm a soccer coach, forgot to say that, at Kennedy High.
Yes. Hi everybody, my name is Marisol. Sol, don't call me Mary. Y'all have seen me in another episode. I'm back as a guest this time, super excited. I'm a third generation Richmond resident. I am also a professor at Contra Costa College for ESL and English, and super excited to talk about this, which I'm coming in to really share what Reimagine Richmond has been doing around the Community Crisis Response Program.
Awesome, thank you guys for sharing. So the first question we have is, what do you love about Richmond?
I love that Richmond is diverse, that there's people that look like me, people that don't look like me, and that when we have an issue, I think the community comes together, really. I love that, I can walk down the street. Again, there's people that look like me and people that don't look like my neighbors. I love that about Richmond. And I love that I grew up here, and that I get to have this experience that others don't get to have. Like, I do love Richmond.
Yeah, I think I really love our community's resilience. Like, to me, we are so resilient, overcoming all odds, every newspaper article that's been written about us, all the stereotypes about Richmond, and yet we are growing, we are loving, we are caring, and we have always kept each other safe, which is one of the reasons that I obviously love Richmond, but also love Reimagine Richmond and all the work that y'all are doing.
Thank you.
So you mentioned the word safe, so now I want to pose to you the question of, what do you think residents need to feel safe and healthy in Richmond?
Yeah, I think Reimagine Richmond has been asking this question for a really, really long time. First, basic needs simply need to be met, and we shouldn't be criminalized for trying to get those needs met. In particular, we shouldn't be criminalized for poverty, for being young, for being undocumented. These are all aspects that I feel, if we were to really have our needs met, which if you look at other community members, when you look at other communities that are predominantly white and are safe, oftentimes it doesn't mean that they're over-policed. It means that they actually have enough resources, they have enough services, they have enough programs to really help their community members. They're not over-policed, they're not over-criminalized.
Thank you for sharing that. Jackie, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, I think similar to Sol, I think it's like giving the voice back to the community members to really say what they need to feel safe. And I think for a really long time, if not for decades, people don't like to get policed, right? If even you go back to the civil rights movement, right? Like the sheriffs, the police departments, they were created, for a purpose. And that was to keep, the people of color separated from the whites, right? And so I think when I think about that, I think, safety is whatever our community wants and deserves, right? Yes. And that's them coming up with the solutions. And I think we have been seeing that through Reimagine Richmond. Y'all have been asking, and the people have been speaking, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's really up to us, to reimagine that. But for me in particular, I think it's being able to come outside without hearing gunshots, right? It's me being able to walk down to the corner and not feel afraid, right? And to not feel afraid of my neighbors. You know what I mean? That's the community, and that's the safety that I want, for my future kids, future grandkids, and for all the youth that I coach.
Yes. Yeah, so you guys mentioned a lot of things that meant safety for you and your community. So we want to ask you guys, what role do police play in in the public safety system, if any?
I think right now there are alternatives. There are community-based solutions that need to be given a try, that need to be funded, invested in, and that means a shift in the way that we look at police. And that's really scary because for a really long time, a certain white majority have really looked at policing as a go-to problem solvers of all things. However, a lot of BIPOC folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, youth of color, undocumented folks that aren't the stereotypical person really are harmed by the policing system. And so if we can't imagine a world beyond policing, then we'll always continue the mass criminalization system. And so I think what Reimagine is trying to do is really look at those community-based solutions, really shift the narrative of the over-dependency on police. And I think as we do that, we'll see that police are really needed for very specific type of calls, but not for every possible problem, every issue. They can't solve mental health. They can't solve poverty. They can't solve suicide attempts. They're simply things that they're not trained for, that they shouldn't be responding to. So I think that's hopefully what we'll get into a little bit more about what does an alternative to police responses looks like in Richmond.
Thank you. Yaquelin, any thoughts?
Yeah, I do believe in them having a particular role, but a role that doesn't like either over police or criminalize, right, or harms or kills, right? I don't think that they should have any role with, the way they handle certain situations. Of course, like there's this notion of like keeping order, and keeping order for me shouldn't involve literally killing someone because someone needs help. There's order that needs to happen, yes, in the community and sometimes in our own households that comes out of our control. But there, like Marisol is saying, like there's certain roles that I think the police should and shouldn't play, and one of them should not be responding to a mental health crisis. One of them should not be responding, just there's so many scenarios out there, right, that just have gone wrong. And so one of them is not using physical force. I truly believe in that. And specifically to youth, undocumented folks, people of color, that's where we do see that as an active role, not just here in Richmond, but across the country.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Jackie, you did mention a couple scenarios of how it can play out with the police and being involved in a mental health crisis. So now I have a question for you, which is, what experience have you had with the police and how did that make you feel?
I've had a few incidents where I literally asked on Facebook, I'm going to be real. And I think some folks that have been thinking about just reimagining what this could look like and having a mental health crisis hotline or just like having this resource. And I remember someone giving me a number, but because it's not fully funded or just, folks are just so against it, I think my scenario could have turned out a lot different. In many instances, and I'm not, just for the safety of my family, I'm not going to mention what family member, but about 3 years ago, and this was also during COVID, one of my family members was experiencing somewhat of a mental health crisis, combined probably with drug use, and so I was terrified. I didn't want to call the police, but I knew that my family member needed help. My mom was asking for help as well, and I knew I couldn't call the police because of our family member status, right? There's multiple members in my family who are undocumented. I have DACA, and so even me calling the police sometimes also feels a little odd. And me calling the police on a family member who doesn't have any status, it's just like, how could I, right? And that could mean deportation. And so for me, just seeing the distress that my family was in, I literally felt helpless. And the fact that I didn't know if somebody was actually going to come out. And the fear of like, if the police does come, like this could possibly mean 2 days later, like my family member is deported and there's children involved, right? And so what is going to happen to the children? What's going to happen to my family? And so just this feeling of like, you know, family separation could happen again, right? We were separated, you know, when we were young, and due to the, you know, just the border and immigrating to this country. And so a lot of like the trauma started coming up even for me. And so the police did show up. Essentially, someone called. If a mental health crisis, like, you know, folks or responders could have come out, the situation again could have been a little different for my own physical and mental well-being, as well as the person that was in crisis. And so I think this was like a domino effect, right? Like the person being affected directly in the moment, and then the rest of the family members that are trying to support, you know, the individual. So I think, I think mental health services are really needed. And instead of like the police being there, having someone there, again, I wouldn't have felt this pain and physical pain in my body for 3 weeks after that incident, right? And no physical things happened between the police and our family, but just their presence inflicted physical and mental harm.
Well, I'm sorry that this happened, but I do want to ask a question on how would a different responder affected the outcome of the situation?
I think that like de-escalation for sure. We could have avoided a lot of shouting, yelling. I think like also for like the children, I think as Latinos, we normally don't, you know, go to therapy, or, you know, we don't know how to de-escalate our own, you know, situations because we haven't been taught or learned like culturally. And so I think even from like the little ones to like all the adults, just someone being able to talk things out and just de-escalating, I think could have avoided, like I mentioned, a lot of like the physical and mental health issues that we had even post that scenario. And the police, I don't think they would have shown up if they knew like maybe a mental health respondent was already there, or the neighbors didn't have to call the police, right? Because the situation would have been de-escalated. Because it was a lapse of about 4 or 5 hours, right? And so those 5 hours, police showed up twice. So just, yeah, you can only imagine what those 5 hours felt like, you know, days, you know, if you ask me.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. I know that definitely, you know, was something that, you know, shouldn't have happened, and probably in the way that it did. And so with that, what do you think you needed in that moment to feel safe, or to really have your safety needs met?
Yeah, I think for someone to really talk to my family member and to kind of be the communicator in between. When someone's going through mental health crisis, I don't think they're going to hear, especially someone that they know. And so having a trained or someone who knows, right, how to de-escalate, or has the tools, or just has a different tone, right? I think that could just like, not de-trigger, because I don't even know what the right word is, but like, I think have a different way of us, you know, communicating really. And I think that could have just led to so many other positive things, but just having someone in between to like just communicate, help us communicate, because the shouting, the physical aggressions just were not helpful, right? And having a trained person, or just folks who actually care enough to not come and just not add fuel to the fire, but like just to make it more intense, like the police presence, having 10 cops show up, right? For a family who's really suffering and going through something. Yeah, I think that could have looked a lot different by having 2-3 people in between, just being the communicators.
You did touch upon about this a little bit, but how did the police not meet those needs? I know you mentioned that like 10 of them showed up, but what actions did they do or take that did not make you feel safe at all?
I think some of the comments, like, oh, we know this family. We've been here before. And the things that they said they did. Oh, we've taken someone in this household before. We've kicked the door open. That was unnecessary for me, right? Again, that just added more to like the trauma and like my own personal triggers of like what the police could actually do in the next 5 minutes, right? Or when they physically did get out of the car, right? And the first thing they do is like they turn their hands and like they're close to their gun, right? And again, not knowing what could happen in those next 10 seconds is terrifying. Just the situation of like young kids being around, involved, like you were literally out open in the community, like what other community members could have been hurt, in the moment. The kids, like my mom. And so it's a lot, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Yaquelin, for sharing that. I know that that's a situation that, unfortunately happened to you, but, we know that a lot of family members, community members might be going through the same thing. And so I'm really, really happy that this is something that we are looking at as a community to really figure out alternatives to the police and really different responders. So I want to ask you, Sol, if you could talk a little bit more about what the Community Crisis Response Program looks like, or how we're reimagining, 911 calls.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, really acknowledging your story. And unfortunately, that's not a unique story, y'all. That this is actually happening way more than not. In particular, Reimagine Richmond, through Transparent Richmond, analyzed some of the data of 2022 for the 911 CAD data, the call center data. And what we found was 6.8% of calls were health and well-being calls in 1 year. On top of, and that could be a mental health call, that could be a suicide attempt call, that could be possible harm in another shape. That's almost 7% of calls a year being responded to for Richmond residents that could be diverted into an alternative response. On top of that 7%, there's another kind of quality of life calls. Those quality of life calls include, disturbances, noise disturbances, etc. And those are actually at 15.9%. And so about 16% of calls in 2022 were quality of life. 7% of calls were health and well-being calls. So over 20%, we're almost looking at 25%, a quarter of calls can actually be diverted into alternative responders. And so, in 2021, City Council, an incredible City Council, progressive City Council that we fought for and that we believes in an alternative response, and they allocated $1 million into a community crisis response program. That's what we know, a lot of us as CCRP. And what is going on now is, in the next couple of months, the city is actually going to be investing that money into choosing a program. And these programs are community-based solutions and alternatives for mental health crisis, or even low-level calls. My neighbor, I haven't seen my neighbor for a couple of days. I would like somebody to check on them, right? There's somebody that I love dear to that is having a mental health crisis. I think we should go ahead and check on them. Those type of calls, what we might define as low-level, non-violent calls, could be diverted. And this program is, and the researchers and Reimagine have even explored all of these models, from Albuquerque to Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered, different responses that could come to our city. And I have to also shout out the Office of Neighborhood Safety. The Office of Neighborhood Safety has violence interrupters, neighborhood change agents that have been working specifically for gun and violence prevention. Now we need to take that to another step, and we need to also start diverting more calls. And the way that Reimagine Richmond has been involved this summer, and y'all have been a part of this, absolutely, is looking at alternative trained responders. And these, thanks to a beautiful artist named Tara, she created these alternative responders, and there's a trained community responder that could have been there. And you use the word de-escalate, conflict mediation, restorative justice practices. Mm-hmm. If that was somebody that came to you and your family in that time of need to help you and to better direct resources, to better care for that family member, what would have that looked like? a community medical responder, not necessarily an EMT, but somebody to just take the blood pressure of your mom that maybe is having a hard time and feeling chest pains because it's so difficult to see a family member. There's so many people that can be impacted by one incident. So how are we creating a holistic approach to care? How are we creating a system of care in the city versus a system of criminalization? And then I really liked, you said that there was youth, and one of the cards that we have is actually a youth worker, somebody that is trained in youth mental health first aid, really understanding youth-centered crisis intervention that can relate to them. And then finally, there's even more in here, but a mental health worker, somebody to really be there, that knows mental health literacy, behavioral health training, suicide prevention, substance use training as well. All of these skills are coming from people that are outside of the police that can serve and create this system of care. And then I know you also mentioned faith in action, so this is the last one I wanted to bring up because I think it's so awesome. This beautiful community healer and counselor. If there was a family member, your family or another family, we have so many Arabic-speaking, Muslim, Yemenis population, Spanish-speaking that are involved with the Catholic Church and iglesias, what if we had an entire system of people to call that says, your pastor is on its way instead of the police. The sister the father is on the way. Any other indigenous practice person that is willing to come and help. So I think that there's so many ways that we can continue to reimagine, and that there's so many alternatives to the police, especially for these type of low-level calls. And so Reimagine Richmond, this is just one way that we're doing this, and it's going to be really important that people show up and turn out to make sure that the city really invests in these different programs.
Thank you, Sol. That was very informative, and I'm glad that you were able to share these cards. We were able to share those with a group of members who came together in our 911 workshop, and there's been a lot of work. So thank you for sharing that.
So you kind of mentioned reimagining. You were talking about the community crisis response program. So now I do want to pose a question to both of you guys. How do you guys reimagine Richmond?
I mean, having a community crisis response team, I think it's part of like us reimagining alternative policing, right? Not just when a crisis happens, right? But it's more of like reimagining the community really being able to come together and seeing all these folks that you mentioned at our community events, and that we are really one. Because in order to feel safe, we need to be in relationship with one another, right? We're not going to feel safe if we're all strangers. And so again, it's like being able to talk to my neighbor, being able to like go across the street and share this information with other families that are in distress. And so I think it's in Espanol, we kind of call it like, que le dices a la tía, el tío, and then it's just like by word of mouth, really. That this gets out, but like you said, so like we have to come out and we have to advocate for these things, because they're not just going to happen from one day to another. And if we really want to reimagine, I think we need to reimagine with our entire community.
I would say I reimagine Richmond with the most services, programs, and resources. Our city investing in the community, in youth and undocumented folks. I imagine a crisis response where the team is hanging out at schools and at churches, and when they receive a call, they can go to the church pantry and say, let me get some basic needs that the church members brought in, that the school people, parents dropped off, to this incredible program. I see this program rooted in Richmond's history, understanding and alleviating the mass criminalization system that has just been hindering, harming our community for so long. And in the end, I think I just see peace and love and care in our beautiful, rich city.
Nice, very nice. So our last question. We just wanted to ask you guys, if you could say anything to your community of Richmond, what would you say?
There's a lot of things. Again, that if we're not investing in young people, undocumented folks, folks who have been impacted already by the criminal, like just the systems overall, who have been formerly incarcerated, if we're not really going to the folks and listening to the voices of those most directly impacted, I mean, we're not going to change anything. And so it really does take all of you, all of us, beyond these conversations, to be inclusive, to get all the voices, and because you all matter. That's what I will say, is that you all matter, we matter, and we can reimagine a safer community. We can imagine more resources, because if they're happening in other communities, they can happen here in Richmond. But we gotta want it, and we gotta act, right? Power is the ability to act, and so we need you all there when we pull this call out.
I would say to my beloved Richmond, I will live and breathe and die for you. I am so proud of where you came from. I am so proud of where you're going to go, and the power that you have, the power to imagine, the power to breathe, to be safe, and the power to act. And so I just, de corazón, from soul, I love you, Richmond, and stay up, in the famous words of my homie Saeed, stay up.
Thanks for tuning into Reimagine Richmond Podcast. A special thanks to all the community members who made this podcast possible. Reimagine Richmond is a movement pushing the city to invest in life-affirming resources and programs. To join the movement, visit our website at reimaginerichmond.org.